Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Uspamandla Mhlongo, Senior Programs Officer here at the Democracy Development Program. And I'd like to welcome you to one of our first webinars with the Mail and Guardian this year. And in this webinar, we'd like to interrogate what the conversation around young and presidential ought to mean. And in that regard, we're going to be speaking to four very astute thinkers in the space, and they'll be essentially unpacking for us from their perspectives, based on the work that they're doing, the research that they've been engaged in, as well as the work that they'd like to do more of insofar as creating that space for young people to be able to participate in the country and in the politics of our country. So in that regard, I think it's important that we start to unpack a number of these things. Of course, you are able to put your questions in the chat section of the engagement. We will also be able to record and stream this on YouTube, Mail and Guardian's YouTube page, after the webinar itself is finished. So if you have missed any parts of this or are experiencing challenges with load shedding, please try and stay on as much as possible. But of course, if you do experience some challenges, don't worry, because we do have a recording that's also available. And so on behalf of the Executive Director, the board of the Democracy Development Program, as well as its staff, we'd like to welcome you into the space. We have with us the following speakers that are going to be unpacking the issues in that regard. So we've got Yanga Madodana, who is a graduate student at the University of Pretoria. She's currently pursuing a master's in political science. Yanga is a recipient of the Andrew Mellon Foundation Scholarship. She's also an Alan Gray Orbis Foundation Fellow. She has been involved in numerous research projects, including several for the School of Policy and Government in partnership with George Mason University. She has worked as a researcher for the Ford Foundation, and her interests primarily lie in digital marketing and urban energy research. She currently works as a political philosophy and policy analysis assistant lecturer at University of Pretoria. She's a communication strategist for us here at the Democracy Development Program and is the assistant manager for the Ford Foundation. Would welcome Yanga. We also have as some of our other speakers, Mr. Lorato Jekeng, who is a reputation management and crisis communication specialist with keen interest in the disruption of life, work, and play by technology. He is the creator of #GovComSocial, a knowledge-sharing platform of government communicators to help decode social media algorithms, understand data and trends, as well as best practices of communicating in this digital age. He's all over the trending spaces in particular, as you might have heard him on various platforms, including SAFM and other media platforms. We've got with us community manager from the Youth Lab, Dimpo Legeu. Youth Lab is a policy think tank that works to mainstream youth participation in community building and policy making. She's also recently been appointed to the Gauteng Youth Advisory Panel by Gauteng Premier David Makura. Of course, she's also now been announced as one of the Mail and Guardian young people to watch, essentially. Mail and Guardian 200 young people and representing civil society. We also have Ms. Crystal Duncan Williams, who is currently the project lead for Youth Capital, which is an advocacy and mobilization campaign focused on ensuring that young people in South Africa have the skills and opportunity to get their first decent job. She also serves on the board of the Center for Social Development in Africa, which is based at the University of Johannesburg. I'd like to welcome all of our speakers and, of course, you as a participant and a key role player in the space. It's important that we also have the ability to service some of your views. So as I said, you're able to ask questions in the comment section, and you're more than welcome to tag us on our various social media pages, which I'll be mentioning shortly after Yanga's presentation. Yanga, you may take the floor. I think please help us unpack sort of the impetus for this discussion. What do you see in relation to young people's political participation in the country, or civic participation at least, and where are the gaps, at least from your sort of understanding of things?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Spamandla, for that intro, and also this giving us this opportunity to be discussing this very important concept, and at a particular time in our history in which it is important now more than ever for young people to be involved in political spaces. I think one of the core obstacles, or at least challenges that we faced with in the discussion that we're talking about today, are the impediments that young people are facing in terms of their political spaces and in terms of political participation. And I think it's very important to preface that, young people are a very creative force and a dynamic source of innovations, and they have undoubtedly, throughout history, participated, contributed, and even catalyzed very important changes in political systems, power sharing dynamics, and economic opportunities. And I think our country is one of those countries that have got prime examples of the role that young people have played in the democratic transition in South Africa in terms of the anti-apartheid movement and overall fight against the apartheid regime. However, we fast forward to 2022 with this new generation of young people, and there's quite a number of challenges that are faced there, which include poverty, barriers to education, multiple forms of discrimination, and overall limited employment prospects and opportunities. And it's not like COVID-19 situation had aided in this situation. It in fact exacerbated it and made it incredibly worse. But I think that in order to truly understand why there is this barrier between young people and political participation, or at least the accessibility into political spaces, it's very important to unpack what are the steps in place that are making young people not be able to access these political spaces to begin with. And I believe that the overarching issue, at least from a number of research that has come up regarding this particular topic, is that there's this mutual distrust between young people and also the system in which they're supposed to be participating in. But particularly here in South Africa, a massive distrust between young people and political parties, or at least the political party system. The lack of trust in the system comes from young people having negative views of politicians, seeing them as figures that are merely acting out of their own personal interests. And this is fueled by issues that have to do with corruption, make it seem as though their interest is merely just for themselves and not necessarily for the entire society. But also, on the other hand, you have got these people who are in positions of power who also don't necessarily have that much trust in young people, because of the fact that young people don't traditionally express themselves in the way that the representative democracy system expects. They express themselves in the outlets that democracy presents, which are a bit more quote unquote radical. So their means of expression come through in terms of protests, come through in terms of marches, and even sometimes can come through in terms of boycotts, right? And so there's very little space and gap for young people and those who are in power to have positions of collaborating and discussing the different issues, or at least come to somewhat of the same page. That then kind of then leads to the interrogation of the idea that there's a lack of participation. But it is very important to see that young people, a study that was done by Afrobarometer not so long ago had shown that it's somewhat of a taboo to say that young people don't participate in political spaces. By mere fact of them going out into the streets and protesting and even using non-traditional means of quote-unquote participation, such as media, is a form of participation, but for some reason, the rigidity of the representative democratic system does not want to recognize that and holds at its esteem voting as the primary mean of participation. But young people have got a dissatisfaction regarding voting because they are of the belief that by going out to vote, they are in fact not going to be heard to begin with by those people who are sitting in those positions of power. There's challenges in representation within the institutional political system. It's very disheartening to not see enough young people in positions of power. And as a result of that, that brings up somewhat of a ripple effect of the fact that if I can't see someone that looks like me, that is of my age, that understands where I come from, why would I go out and vote for people who don't represent me, right? But then there's overall just the rigidity, like I'd mentioned, of the institutional systems as well, where they're quite reluctant to change and to also be embracing new ideas, and these new forms of expression and mobilization are also just not taken into account, right? And so then, essentially that's kind of like the situation that we are left with over here, where we have young people that are aware of their circumstances, that they are aware of the challenges that they have to be facing every single day, but they feel as though they cannot trust the system to truly deal with the problems that they're facing in today's society. So I'm very excited to see kind of like where everything goes from the other speakers on perhaps how we can start to engage with these problems, how we can tackle them head on, what type of solutions we can come up with it. But yeah, that's currently the context in which we are operating today and in which we are having this discussion.
Thank you very much, Yanga. I think that was a very insightful start. I think it's important that we start to ask serious questions of ourselves as civil society organizations, as practitioners of civic education in particular. If the ways in which we've chosen to frame the clear sort of fight back from young people, at least insofar as the systemic challenges that exist, insofar as the way in which we expect people to participate, whether we've done enough to either help their campaign insofar as ensuring that there are other forms of representation, or at least the other forms of participation are taken as seriously as the more traditional means, and then moving it to a space where we can actually create some people that look like us who have the ability to represent us, at least insofar as the youth demographic is concerned. And in light of that, in trying to get to a space where we have a fundamental understanding of what it means for young people to occupy those very important spaces. If we look at the demographics of our National Assembly, for instance, you can see that clearly young people in those spaces are not necessarily considered as important role players by the existing political elite. The deployment, for instance, of the individuals who participated at the level of at least of the Fees Must Fall movement and Roads Must Fall movement, and we've seen that them starting to occupy some seats in the National Assembly and some in some provincial governments, such as Gauteng, for instance. It's interesting that that work is starting to happen, but should it be more significant insofar as the number of young people represented in those spaces? If we look at the executive, for instance, the current cabinet of our country, they say they have young people, but we all can see that the young people that they have largely are young at heart, and not necessarily the sort of demographic that ought to be representative of the young people that we see in our country. And so, in order to be able to talk to us about perhaps why that is important, why is it important to see other young people occupy spaces such as cabinet positions, for instance, and why we haven't seen that happening, and also what needs to change in order for that to happen. We have with us Mr. Lorato Chekeng, who will be speaking to us about his campaign around young and presidential, and why he thought that was an important part of conversation to start, or at least part of discourse, to start us thinking about what this means. I've seen some amazingly accomplished young people, to the extent that I feel, hey, what am I doing with my life? if other young people are as accomplished as those that Mr. Chekeng has promised. Of course, the other question that you sometimes hear around sort of deploying young people is people say they don't have enough experience, they don't have the right skills. But based on the Twitter threads that we've seen Mr. Chekeng show up, that question is actually invalid. Mr. Chekeng, what are your thoughts?
Good afternoon, Ms. Pamanda, and good afternoon to the fellow panelists, and good afternoon to everyone who has joined us this afternoon. I think, firstly, congratulations to you for hosting this conversation on Mandela Day, right? And I think its importance of hosting it today, I firstly want to reflect on, if you consider that when Nelson Mandela became president back in 1994, not only was it important from a point of, the ushering in the new dispensation. For the first time, we had a lot of, people that looked like us, or at least who were demographically representative. And that was a very key moment in our society where it was not only about, underrepresentation, and even if you look at the ages, for instance. So in 1994, one of the ministers was Tito Mboweni. Tito Mboweni was only 35 at the time. Right, you had one of the youngest people in, although deputy ministers are not part of the cabinet, but Toko Didiza was the youngest at about at 29, right, back in 1994. And you then take 28 years later, and you look at how if we have progressed to at least one, maintaining that kind of momentum where to a great extent cabinet, government, governance, and many positions, whether it's in the state-owned entities or a number of significant state organs and organizations, whether there's that representativity from a youth perspective. Unfortunately, we have regressed badly so. In fact, I think that the youngest deputy minister now with President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration is 42, right? And that is where one would have at least expected that if in 1994 the youngest minister was 29, surely we should have at least just kept that, where, because we then use that as almost a springboard of some sort, where you literally are preparing these young people who then ought to be ready to take over the next level, which is then being in the executive, in cabinet in particular. Because even if you were to go to the 9 provinces, right, not a lot of them have younger people. So you could even say, if we're using provinces, your MECs and your premiers as an example, or at least as a way of springboarding, the picture that we see at national level, unfortunately, is almost as similar at provincial level. You asked the questions, Pamandla. So why did I consider or at least think about the campaign that I started, Young and Presidential? So I was having a conversation with friends just before Youth Month, and the question I asked was, what are some of the key anecdotes and rhetoric that comes out whenever people talk about young people and leadership, right? And why is it that because, and again, unfortunately, with a party system that we have in South Africa, where we've had for the past 28 years a dominant ANC, or at least one party that has been dominant in terms of national politics. Of course, the Democratic Alliance as the second biggest party, also in the Western Cape. There's similarities there. The leadership is still relatively older. And the question was, what are some of the things that people are saying, or at least are projecting about young people and leadership? And of course, you've pointed to the one, right? They raise issues about that young people have the education, but they don't have the requisite experience, right? And I thought perhaps it's not that there aren't enough young people with experience. The likelihood is that we don't do enough of a showcase of these young people with experience. And maybe to some extent, as communicators, or even as people that want to see things change for the better, right? We are not then doing our bit to showcase some of these young people. And that's really how the campaign started. I thought that, you start with somebody as amazing as Lihle Ngobozi, right? Who, not only is she, a highly accomplished young person, she also sits on an advisory council at the Department of Public Enterprises, right? So even if you were to try and raise that question around that, you therefore cannot discount somebody like Elihle. You look at an Ayabonga Kawe. Similarly, he sits on the economic advisory panel chaired by the president. And there are many of those young people. And somebody could even say, yeah, but you look at the cream of the crop, or whatever the case may be. I even went to a point where I said, perhaps one of the things that we must do is that don't only look at people who, are big in academic, when you look at academic achievement, also look at activists. There's a young man, Akolile Nokwala in the Western Cape. He is one of the was this justice coalition movement, and now he has started a movement called Movement for Care, right? Working in the space of social justice, particularly with the people around, in the peri-urban areas of your Kailichas, Nyanga, and the likes, doing phenomenal work, but also infusing the education educational knowledge that he has gained to propel his social justice cause. So the biggest thing perhaps is that, one, we must acknowledge that we are not looking around. That is the first problem. But the second problem is that we have a problem of people who say something but then mean another. And I sometimes, in fact, I often use this analogy. Our parents, right? They take us to school. Think about, and let me use medical students in particular. So they you take your child to go and study medicine. After 6 years, they've completed. They are now, in community service. And when you go to a practice, you find this. They find this 24, 25-year-old, right? So the same old person who would have funded their own child to go and study, when they find a doctor that is 25 years old, they almost want, to say, no, but you are too young to treat me and the likes. And the biggest question, therefore, is, if you believed that educating your child and funding their education to become a medical doctor and complete on time and be able to service people, who are they supposed to service if they don't service you and your peers? So the incongruency between the things that we say around underrepresentation of youth and how we then respond to some of them when they are in there. That's the second thing that I think we need to consider and correct, our language and what we believe, or at least from a paradigm point of view. The third one is co-option. So if you listen to the language that the governing party, the ANC, uses, right, they would talk about generational mix. And if you look at what that generational mix essentially is, that we are a group of grown-ups, pensioners, in fact, in the main, and we are going to find a few young people and sprinkle them along, around us. So that generational mix is not even about a true integration of a strategy that looks at changing the status quo. So co-option is the one of those things that I've observed. And perhaps if we continue with these kinds of showcase, right? Because what the advantage with the showcase does is that, so if you were to look at the latest mid-year population estimates, and I use the mid-year population estimates because Stats SA is busy with finalizing the 2022 census, right? When you look at particularly the ages of young people. So if you're looking at Black Africans, for instance, the most number of people are those that are between 30 and 34, and it's constituting about 4.8 million of them, right? And the biggest question is, it should not only really be about, because these people are so many, therefore there should be a push for representation. My argument is that Spamandla and panelists and everyone who has joined us is to say, if we agree that representation matters, and we use instruments such as the Black Economic Empowerment to then drive change to ensure that there is representation, the demographics are as represented. Why are we not intentional about youth representation? And of course, the challenge with politics, and this is where I'd like to put a comma on, right? I am a co-founder of Rivonia Circle and also a director at the Rivonia Circle. Some of you would know that our executive chairman, Songezo Zibi, has written a book called The Manifesto, a New Vision for South Africa. the biggest key take out there is encouraging professionals to take part in the civil service, or at least to be part of the civil service, right? Because if you consider that the first question that I raised around experience, right, where people believe that we don't have enough experience, perhaps there is some credence to that. So to address this question is to say, one, if we are as successful in respective sectors, in the private sector in particular, it does not give, or it does not follow that we'll be successful in government, right? Therefore, there's this need for us to then find a way of intersecting the private sector experience and experience in the public sector. And perhaps, in the words of in the words of the editor of the Sunday Times, Stembiso Msomi, as he was summing up what his takeaway was from Songezo Zibi's book. He said, open quote, "Professionals, get off your butts and take your space," close quote, right? And I guess it's that for young people to say, while you are always, when somebody asks you, where do you see yourself in 5 years? If you are an accountant, it will either be one of the big four audit firms, or if you are a CFA, it's one of the four banks. If you are a lawyer, it's one of the biggest four law firms. We should be perhaps thinking a little bit about this political participation that Younger was even referring to. A lot of younger people, and it's almost inherent that those who were part of the student politics are likely to consider the civil service as a career choice, right? But those who may not have been in the public service, perhaps it's a moment now to really be thinking about that, to say, should we be considering the public service as a career option? I'll put a comma there for now, Spamanda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorato. I think that was very insightful as well. I think the work of bridging the gaps as it relates to the private sector versus work in the public sector, for instance, is quite important. There used to be some talk back, I think a couple of years ago, in terms of whether we should have a year of service for graduates, for instance, as it relates to volunteering, or at least interning in some state institution that relates to your career choice, for instance, at least as a way in which to try and plug some of the questions around experience insofar as work and unemployment and so forth. But you make some interesting cases, at least for us to start digesting a bit further, in terms of what we ourselves ought to start doing and thinking. The languaging, for instance, is quite an important one around how we frame youth participation. The idea of apathy has been quite significant insofar as the ways, because then apathy absolves us as people, or as institutions, in terms of doing more work, because all we're saying is the blame lies there with young people, and it's not at all about the ways in which we need to shift and engage ourselves better. And perhaps to talk a bit to us about that is a community manager from the Youth Lab, Dimpo. Dimpo, based on your work with various young people at community level in particular, what do you think are some of the impediments towards actual participation and somewhat the full realization of young people's intentions, at least, to be the ones who are steering the larger conversations in our country, whether it be policy or at least even at implementation level, insofar as what young people and this country deserves insofar as the shift is concerned?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think conversations around youth political participation are always so interesting for me, right? Because one of our values at Youth Lab is that we're non-partisan. So we really try and create space for young people to have a political voice, but we think a lot about what that looks like when young people don't have political affiliation. So a lot of the young people we work with are youth who are leaders, but at a community level, at grassroots level, young people who are kind of big on designing and implementing community work, right? Which is fantastic, but when you're doing community work, when you're doing that kind of work, at some point, you need to interact with the municipality, for example. You need to interact with some kind of structure, especially when you're thinking about scaling your work. So then how do those young people get to influence the decisions that are being made in their communities politically, even if they don't have political affiliation? And one of the things that we have done, I think particularly over the last 2 years that I've been at Youth Lab, is we focused a lot around civic education. I think one of the impediments, the reasons why young people don't participate in civic processes is because they don't know what the opportunities for them to participate and to make their voices heard within various civic processes are. I think Uyanga, right at the beginning, spoke about voting, right? And how we view voting as this be-all and end-all of like democratic or civic participation. And that's problematic, number one, because voting happens once every 5 years. But also, I think to one of the points Yanga made as well is young people are staying more and more away from the polls because they don't feel like they are represented within South Africa's political landscape. And so that can't be the only way that young people can participate. So in between, what are some of the processes that young people can actively participate in to influence decisions? So IDP processes, for example, within municipalities, within communities, but also we also focus a lot on policy, right? There are many different policies and amendment bills and so forth that come out that concern young people. For example, the National Youth Policy draft came out 2 years ago, and the Department of Women and Youth put out the draft on Twitter, and they kind of said, hey, young people, this is the draft of the National Youth Policy between now and 2030, have your say. But there isn't a lot of work around actually finding out if young people are able to interact with that document, right? It is incredibly long. The language is incredibly academic most of the time. And so there's no work being done to make sure that we're breaking down this policy and making it digestible, because we're saying ultimately we want young people's inputs. So we have done a lot of work to make those kinds of things accessible to young people. So taking policies that have to do with, around education, around women, around safety, basically anything that impacts a young person's life, which is almost everything. And we try and make those policies as digestible as possible in terms of language, but also accessible in that we bring those things closer to young people, mainly using our social media platforms. And then we conduct discussions, right? These mainly happen on WhatsApp. We have a WhatsApp policy group together with Youth Capital, where we invite young people to make inputs, and then we make joint submissions. And so it's been very important, I think, for us to do that kind of work, because occupying, I think, political positions or, political participation doesn't just look like one thing. It doesn't just look like political affiliation. It doesn't just look like ascending to a seat, in the National Council of Provinces or in the National Assembly. It's also about how are you able to interact with governance as a whole, right? How are you able to interact with governance and the decisions that are being made around that? And I think throughout, not just in terms of elections. So that's one thing. I think education and making sure that young people have the civic education that they need to participate in civic processes, we found has been a challenge, and we have tried to use our various social media platforms, digital platforms, to encourage civic education and civic participation for youth. I think another stumbling block for young people, particularly those who do want to then take up space in political leadership, is resources. One of the stories that I talk about is a gentleman called Utiamo from Bloemfontein. And we interacted with him sometime last year because he was running a massive campaign, and he was running as an independent candidate in last year's municipal elections. And he was obviously saying that he doesn't have the budget that a candidate, from one of the big three political parties who's contesting the same ward with him has. And so, he's limited in terms of how he's able to reach people. He's limited in terms of how he's able to structure his campaign. But also, I think, one of the things that he mentioned outside of resources is just talking about how I think the electoral system as a whole is not geared to favor independent candidates. And so they had done a lot of campaigning, a lot of education, kind of reaching out to people and showcasing their work. And by the time they had enough people willing to actually put their names down and vote for them, the registration process, I think, for voters had closed, because it closes a couple of months before actual elections take place. And so one of the things that he pointed out, I think, in our interactions with him as well, is that the fact that the electoral system is not set up to favor young people, even when we create space like allowing independent candidates to put their names forward and I think contest elections. But I also want to speak to, I think, how we can get young people to influence decisions, even outside of holding political office, right? So how do we get young people to still be able to sit at critical decision making tables? So a week ago, I attended a youth symposium in Uganda. And so there was a lot of education around how they ensure youth participation in parliament, youth participation, I think, in governance. And it was interesting to learn that they have 5 seats in their National Assembly that are reserved for young people. So in every sitting of their National Assembly, there are 5 youth representatives who come from the various political parties who are there permanently to champion the issues of young people. So I think that's one thing. We first need to find ways to make it law, like legislate young people becoming leaders and occupying political office. I think it's not good enough for young people to occupy political seats, but we also need to make sure that they're not there as tokens, right? So how do we measure that young people are being meaningfully engaged? And to the young people who actually do get to occupy those leadership positions, how do we then ensure that they are championing the issues of young people and making sure that the voices of young people broadly are being heard? You mentioned something about me being on the Gauteng Youth Advisory Panel, which is, I think, the first youth advisory panel throughout the country. And that panel came to be because young people who are occupying positions within provincial leadership structures here in the province kept agitating for it and lobbying for it, right? And saying, well, if you're saying you want to create a youth development strategy that's going to mainstream youth participation in the province, you cannot make those decisions without the voices of young people who are on the ground and kind of working with young people on a day-to-day basis. So how do we mainstream those young people's voices? And that's how, at least that's one of the ways how the advisory panel came to be. I also agree with Olorato that especially as communications practitioners, we need to be able to create platforms that tell stories that center the experiences of young people. So continuing to showcase the very important and I think deep work that young people continue to do and continue to be committed to in their communities. We also ran a campaign during Youth Month where we were spotlighting young people who are driving solutions to social problems in their communities. And a lot of them were maybe even below the age of 25, but had such a rich track record of leadership and problem solving. And we thought it was very important to amplify those voices, especially because I think in the space we get used to seeing a lot of the same faces and I think hearing about the same people. But there are so many more young people in different communities who are doing really great work. So it was important for us to showcase that. I also think that, like I mentioned, we can improve youth participation then through capacity building and greater civic education. And I think looking at how we use particularly digital platforms to encourage youth civic education, and then also thinking about how do we continue to make space for young people who don't want to have political affiliation to still have a political voice. I spoke to Tessa Dooms a couple of weeks ago during Youth Month about how do we get those young people who do have a positive track record as community leaders and organizers and activists into office, because a lot of them may not have the necessary training. And I mentioned one of the programs that are quite popular. I think now it's called Future Elect. And it's a program that's set up to teach young people who want to serve in public office about governance, even though they don't have experience. So I think being able to support programs like that and have more of them, especially nationally, like Olerato mentioned as well, where young people and even professionals or young people in academia can really start to think about taking up space in public office, but also being able to have the resources and the support that equips them to do so. I think I'll pause there for now.
Thank you very much, Dimpo. I think that was a good chunk of the conversation that you were able to present to us, and I think it's important that taking note of some of the comments and questions that are coming out from the chat section. We do also have a comment from Tulasi Zwembata, for instance. He says, "It's my wish one day this part of conversation should be coming in lower level in different places, like an open debate about why as the youth we are distancing ourselves in political activities, and come up with a solution on how we can associate with politics, at least at community level in particular, to gain more experience." And I think that's an important part of the conversation that we shouldn't lose in the ways in which we talk about this, that youth participation, young people's ambitions to be able to get into the different spaces, I think it's an important one, particularly when we think about what excludes certain groups of people, so far as access to data, for instance, because we're hosting this live. There's a sort of a presumption at times with organizations like ourselves that everyone has access to these tools. And so in the instance that when we recognize that people don't have access to these tools, how do we make sure that we reach other communities who might not have access to data, for instance, as readily as some people? We also may have a comment from Ganyesus Milan, who says Dimpo makes an extremely crucial point in civic education. We need to have knowledge about the political spaces or processes before even thinking about getting involved. One solution he suggests would be introducing political education as a compulsory subject in secondary schools. Young people are mainly professionals because they have been educated solely to become professionals in a certain field. And so particularly in grade 11 and 12, students who are about to be eligible should be at least engaged in some level of civic education or political education, at least. The concept of political education sometimes looks very partisan because of the nature of our party politics in this country have created that rift in our society. So you're either this color or that color or a different color altogether. And so it's important that we then start to think about how to reframe these conversations in a way that is broader and more encompassing of all of us in the space. So as I talk about the differences in access and the ways in which different people engage information differently, it's also important to note that political activism, for instance, is extremely expensive, and sometimes as people who work in organizations who do this work, there might be a tendency to consider it easy to understand and easy to unpack, but there are other lived experiences that limit the participation of young people in the various spaces. And Crystal Duncan Williams, as a project lead for Youth Capital, they've done quite a lot of work in understanding some of the impediments of young people to actually get a foothold into the employment market. And so even when it comes to instances when you're not deployed, it seems that there are still barriers for young people to be able to access employment, for instance, beyond the idea of participating actively politically. But there's still a sense that young people are not being absorbed by the system enough. And in some instances, it seems that there are specific barriers against that participation. And so the Youth Capital has done some work and has even released a documentary called 8 Years Without a Job. Perhaps, Crystal, if you could take us through some of your thoughts as it relates to the subject matter at hand, but also in terms of the findings that you've done in the numerous sort of forms of research that you've undertaken, insofar as what are some of the impediments and also what can be done for us to be able to get over to the other side, or at least see the potential for another side to exist.
Thanks, Pamandla, and thanks to the other panelists for the comments so far. I think, I agree with everything that's been said, and I think what we forget in these conversations, because as Pamandla says, those of us that work in, civic education or political engagement are so steeped in it. that, we can sometimes lose sight of the fact that young people are whole human beings, right? They may have a political interest. They may want to engage politically in a non-partisan way, but they also have responsibilities. They have families to look after, or parents to look after, children to look after, and they need to have some kind of income, whether that's a job or a hustle or whatever that looks like. And so, our focus at Youth Capital is around, creating an easier entry into creating some kind of sustainable livelihood for young people. And that might seem like a narrow focus and a bit tangential to this conversation, but it's not. And I think that's important to remember. Being without work or an income for young people permeates into every aspect of their lives and impacts on their ability to participate in these kinds of conversations, to add value into political conversations. It's not that, young people are apathetic. It's all of the things that all of the panelists have already said, absolutely. And the comments coming in, the language, how we engage with young people, where we meet them, do we meet them in a community hall? Do we meet them in a Twitter space? Young people are a heterogeneous group in this country, and we need to find ways of engaging with them that speak to the different types of young people that exist, whether that is your young aspiring leader, like Dumbo spoke about, these amazing young people who are already showing these strong track records of leadership, but don't know how to get into the political spaces to leverage that talent and that skill for the benefit of the greater population, or whether that's just a young person who has no desire to be in the political sphere, to be an MP, to be a president, but wants to, have their voice heard and wants to shape the political discourse and the policies that affect their lives, whether it's with their vote, whether it's commenting on a policy, whether it's holding their ward councillor accountable for some implementation that was promised during the municipal elections, whatever it is. And so I think we need to understand the barriers that young people face. And Spamandla spoke about the report that we launched a few months ago called Beyond the Cost, where it showed that 8 in 10 young people are saying that they have to choose between looking for work or putting food on the table. So, young people having to choose either, looking for work or going for an interview, or putting food on the table for that month. Young people are spending up to 1,000 Rand just on data and transport costs to look for work. And when we think at a basic food basket, costs in the region of 900 Rand these days, that's a choice. That's the real choice that young people have to make. And I think we have to bear that in mind when we speak about that. And I think, to the documentary that we launched, 8 years without a job, and I've been trying, is what one young person says that we spoke to. And the thing that comes across from the 9 young people that we spoke to in that documentary is, I won't be young for forever. And I think that's the other thing that we sometimes forget in this conversation, this period of youth, this energy that we want to harness of young people, and the drive and the innovation that comes from, this period of youthfulness in one's life, it's not going to be there for forever. And we need to understand that we need to act now to remove the barriers that young people face to accessing space. So whether that's data, because a lot of these conversations are easier to join online. If you're in a rural area that, the government might say, we're going to do consultations across the country on the new national youth policy. We're going to do one in each province. One in each province is a drop in the ocean for including the youth voices from that province. I think we can all agree on that. So what are the mechanisms in which we can engage with young people in places where they are already? And as Dimpo said, Youth Capital in collaboration with Youth Lab started this, this policy conversation on WhatsApp during lockdown, actually. As lockdown hit, the national youth policy was up for comment, and we just reacted to the situation. And we know that people have issues with data, with load shedding. You don't have cell phone coverage, you don't have network coverage, your phone dies. These are all problems that we face, and there's no one silver bullet that is it can allow all young people to be included. But to my earlier point of how do we offer multiple points of entry? One, the point that's raised around the language and the jargon that's used, and Youth Lab and Youth Capital, I think, have been doing a lot of work in breaking things down, particular policies that we think young people will want to engage with, and making it accessible and saying to young people, these are the high level points. Let's just talk about these ones to make it easier to engage with. whether that's creating a WhatsApp group, whether that's having a Twitter space with, people who can add values and insights that might help young people kind of form an opinion about a particular topic. And then I think another point of the conversation that gets missed often, and one that I feel very strongly about, is accountability. So once we have young people in power, once we've submitted our comments on this new policy, do we then sit back and say our work is done as young people, or do we say, well, actually now the work really starts? Now we have to start holding these political leaders accountable, whether they're young people or old people that we're kind of annoyed because they don't understand what it's like to be young in South Africa. But how do we hold them accountable to the promises that we make? How do we hold them accountable to these amazing policies? We've got some really great policies in this country, but the implementation falls flat. And the implementation falls flat because, one, there isn't an understanding of what it's like on the ground, particularly for young people, and two, that nobody's actually holding them accountable. The National Youth Policy came out, with a big launch and fanfare at the beginning of last year, and we've had no report. There's no M&E framework that's come out since then. We have the Integrated Youth Development Strategy, and there was, again, a big event earlier this year, where, some of the wins were kind of highlighted, but there isn't, again, that report is long, it's very complicated to follow. How are we putting platforms forward that young people can quickly engage with and say, oh, you said you were going to create 1 million jobs and you've actually only done like 20,000. That's a very big discrepancy. What are you doing about it? Where is the platform and the space for young people to engage with that? And so I think if I go back to the barriers that young people face, if we understand those barriers, then we can start to create solutions that remove those barriers and make it easier for young people to engage on these topics and on this conversation and in these conversations, and to make sure that when we have young representatives, that they actually aren't, as Dimpo said, tokenistic, because that has happened too often in this country. And because, as Mamandla said, the nature of our political system, it's very political, and often it's not necessarily a young person that reflects the lived experiences of the majority of young South Africans, but it's through political sway that person gets that position. And so how do we start shaping and putting pressure on these people to say, you have a huge responsibility, because the youth representation in positions of power is so limited in this country, and you're one of the few people who have got a seat at the table, and you really need to use the seat that you have and the space that you have for the benefit of the majority of South Africans, regardless of their political affiliation, because we need to start putting young people at the center of these conversations in a way that we haven't. And I think listening to everybody here today, I think I'm preaching to the choir, but how do we get to the ear of those people who are very stuck in their ways? We often hear older people saying, oh, it's too hard to work with young people, and they've got their own way of doing things. And I think we need to change the mindset, and I think that begins with having those people join these conversations. And I'm not sure how we go about that, but I think that's where we have to start. Thanks, Mamandla.
Thank you very much, Crystal. I think we're going to talk quite a bit more on the question of accountability, and I think that's a very important question when we get to sort of wrapping up, because I think whilst it's important for us to create the platform, we also have to be able to have the ability to measure some of the impact of the different spaces that we set up, but also in terms of the inputs that young people are making into the space. We also have to ask questions of them insofar as, okay, what are you going to do with this now? Based on the fact that it's not owned by us as organizations, it's not owned by us as individuals, but it is the work that young people themselves are in a position to generate. If I can just speak then to Lorato and Dimpo for the next sort of short segment. So there's a question from Paul Kariuki, both Lorato and Dimpo, insofar as what are political parties willing, to what extent are political parties willing to allow emerging young people with leadership potential in their own parties to take leadership responsibilities? And I think that's an important question, especially when we think about political parties are creating currently. They are the dominant sort of factions or individuals who create that linkage, either to deploying you in one official capacity or the other, but also have the ability to impact on policy conversations. Based on your assessment, are political parties doing that work? And then as a secondary part of that is it really their work? Whose work is it? Particularly because young people are the ones who are not turning up to the polls. If people are expressing a frustration about young people must stop complaining and young people must just vote, what is that legitimate, or is there something about that we need to start thinking through better?
Should I go first, Dimpo?
Yes, you can go first, Lorad.
Oh. So and again, for the past 28 years, we've had one dominant party, right? And there will then be our point of reference. So if you look at, if you consider the ANC the African National Congress is currently going through, preparation towards their elective Congress in December. Just look at the number of provincial leaders that have been selected, that have been elected into positions, and make your own assessment. You'll realize that this youth leadership is not coming across, right? If you look at, on the other hand, with the Democratic Alliance, you're having a number of brilliant young leaders who, for one reason or the other, are leaving the party. Of course, there still are some who are still in some leadership positions or so. So if you consider the trajectory of things, you can then tell that while the ANC is speaking left, it is walking right, because we know that the outcomes of these elective congresses, whether it's at a regional level, at a provincial level, which subsequently it is going to be in December at a national level, it therefore means that we can then expect for them not to be able to achieve what they term generational mix, because it's literally just going to be that core option of young people. What ought to be done? The Rivonia cycle exists precisely for this reason, that we are observing that the party political system is not aiding in reimagining the political culture. And it is for this reason that we believe that there's a need for a reimagination of the political culture. And of course, we've been affirmed with, at Rivonia Cycle, we run a program called the Democracy Builder. And in the conversations that we are having predominantly with young people, right, as they express what their views are on, or at least their perspectives are on, concepts like politics, government and governance, activism and advocacy, right? You can tell that these are not, as we always term them, apathetic beings or people that are disinterested in politics. They actually are. The only difference is how they define it for themselves. And the biggest question, therefore, is how do you then create a space that is going to, capture their perspectives, views, take them into consideration. But most importantly, as Dimpo used the example of a Tsiamo, raise the Tsiamos of this world, because Tsiamo says, I am available. I know what the problem is, but I also believe that I am going to be part of the solution. But I also acknowledge my shortcomings, whether it's capacity, whether it's access to resources, both human capital and financial resources, but also the kind of exposure that is required. So perhaps, Pamandla, the biggest thing really is there to recognize that the current system is broken. The current players are not intentional, and they are not going to be our solution. Therefore, there is a deliberate need for recreate or reimagining, and therefore looking at an alternative system that is definitely going to ensure that we get the best out of this youth bulge that we have in South Africa.
Yeah, I hear you, Lorato. Dimpo, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everything Olerato has said. Just the fact that our current political system makes it very, very difficult, even for, I think, the most brilliant political young minds, to ascend in their own political parties and, eventually occupy political office provincially, even nationally. At the beginning, you mentioned Fees Must Fall, right? And how a lot of the people we saw emerge during Fees Must Fall as leaders, only after Fees Must Fall, we then began to see them, take up leadership in provinces and otherwise. And so I think that speaks to this weird narrative that young people always need to fight for their place before they can take up leadership positions. Lorato mentioned that, our example is the party that's been leading over the past, 28 years. And the narrative is that, these are people who we've kind of fought for our place. We have fought for our right to govern. We were freedom fighters. We went through the struggle. And so now we're occupying these positions. And so if young people say that they're capable, they also need to fight. So I think we need to maybe just deal with that. I'm not sure if it's a historical thing, if it's a cultural thing, or both, but there's this very weird expectation that young people need to show battle scars before they can be trusted with positions of leadership, even within their own political parties. That's the first thing that we've observed. And I think that's why we talk a lot and we do a lot of work around getting young people to influence politics and influence governance outside of political affiliation, because we also recognize that the current party political system is not working and it's not allowing young people to do that. Secondly, I think I always like to make mention of youth leagues when I answer that question, because youth leagues are created for that purpose, right? For young people to join political parties, be able to, kind of create a political ideology, have a political voice, but also be trained, in politics, but also then eventually with the purpose of them taking up space in governance. And what we've observed over the years is that's not happening. Youth leagues within political parties have become a ground to fight various factional battles. There's been a lot that's happened around youth leagues and even the processes that they use to elect their leadership that tell us that this is not a place, I think, that's kind of preparing young people to take up leadership positions within politics. And so that's why I think it's important for more non-partisan platforms and institutions like your Rivonia circles and your future elects, I think, to get the support that they need to train young people. I saw a question in the chat box, and I just want to say something in reference to that. And I think it was around, is it enough for young people? Is civic education alone enough to train young people or prepare young people to take up leadership positions? And I think, we need to think about how we define kind of like experience. We need to think about what it means for people to be equipped with the resources, the content that they need to be able to take up these positions, but also think about what governance means, right? Because if you're a young person stepping into political office, you're not going to lead alone, right? You have people supporting you, you have advisors around you, you're basically going to have a team. And I think this issue of young people don't have capacity is often used to keep young people out of these spaces. But the idea is that when young people do take up these leadership positions, they won't be leading alone. And when we say young people need to take up leadership, we're not saying that people who are older leave. What we're ultimately saying is we need to find a way for this intergenerational dialogue and co-creation and co-leadership to exist.
Thank you very much, Dimpo. I think maybe sometimes the conversation is that older people need to leave. But I think at this point, we're going to be in a space where we are trying to learn from one another. So the idea is that if you're leading a space, how sustainably are you leading that space? Is there a 10-year plan? And insofar as that 10-year plan is concerned, how much are you engaging your younger colleague or someone? Is there a space for mentorship? Is there a space for guiding young people into actually becoming a part of the space? And it's interesting when we talk about experience and capacity that it's weird how it doesn't necessarily feel as though we've expected the same from the current crop of political leadership. If you think about it, outside of a few government ministers, MECs, and councillors, many of the individuals in government that have been deployed by party political structures aren't actually quite employable if you were to try and canvass for their employment in the professional sort of, in the spaces, in the corridors of corporate, for instance. And so if we question employability and capacity from young people as it relates to their capacity to lead in those some of those political offices, or even their capacity to lead in some of those institutions of government, I think it's important that we don't have a double standard in the ways in which we'd like them to be present and available for that leadership. Of course, we do have two more questions from Ms. Putela Mieni, and I'd like for Yanga and Crystal to perhaps think through these things with us. In terms of political participation, or rather in terms of participation, Yanga, what are young people reading and watching in terms of politics? Ms. Mieni says, is a complicated jargon used by politicians during speeches unappealing? And then, of course, there was a question around professionalism and professionalization. And so Ms. Mieni says, is South African politics sufficiently evolved for professionalism? Very few politicians understand the mindset of the majority, and that is used to empower their minds in the absence of professionalism. Why should young people pursue professionalism if all it takes is a few words to convince the masses? And I'm not sure, Ms. Mieni, you can clarify for us, as perhaps we might give feedback, but what I understand from that question is, from your understanding of the way in which our political system is working, the ways we don't demand a lot from a professional standpoint insofar as our politicians are concerned. So they don't need to have a special skill, for instance, in order to be able to be deployed in certain offices. And so in a lot of those conversations, when we talk about young people's capacity, we also make reference to their qualifications. We make reference to all of these different levels of education that they should have undergone in order to be able to be meaningfully engaged in the space of leadership. But there's a sense that we don't expect the same from our other political parties and from some of our other political actors. And so in the instance that we don't expect the same across the board, should young people be pursuing that line of sort of professionalizing in order to be able to qualify for political office, in order to qualify for presidential office even? So can we let's start with Yanga, and then we'll have Crystal thereafter.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I think, Putela, thank you very much for your questions. I think they're very challenging and require us to really engage with some very complex ideas and opinions regarding, participation. I think it's very interesting that you've brought up whether or not the jargon that is used by politicians in their speeches is unappealing. And that is obviously based on the assumption that young people watch politicians' speeches to begin with. And if they do watch their speeches, do they watch the whole thing? Let's say if it is manifestos that are happening, do they watch the entire speech from beginning to end? Or do they watch snippets of it which have been edited online, which either have come up into the form of like a meme or have come up into being some sort of soundbite, which is something that is a bit more popular on platforms such as TikTok. So I think the way I would rather engage with that question is, instead of focusing on what is it that young people are reading and watching, we should rather shift our focus more so towards how are young people experiencing politics, and are they aware of the circumstances in which they are experiencing politics? And from there, what do they proceed to watch, or what do they proceed to read to either make informed decisions or to formulate the ideas on how they see the political processes around them? And oftentimes, it usually starts off with a particular experience that they have, and based on that experience, how they engage with political processes is often formulated by that. And the best way to understand these experiences is by engaging with the types of lenses that young people have. I've seen so far, in this discussion that we've had very little definition of the types of young people that we are speaking about. As it stands, we classify young people to be from the ages of 14 to about 35 years old. But those are actually two completely different generations. And since they are two different generations, their concerns at particular points in time and their priorities regarding the political system are going to be different, and how they experience it regarding the material that they consume is going to be different. Let's take, for example, in a situation of where let's say it's a 14-year-old South African youth who, let's say, has gone through the traditional trajectory and has been able to make it to a high school level. They haven't necessarily dropped out. Their closest means of quote unquote reading and understanding and watching political participation is technically whatever comes from their life orientation textbook. And if we're going to assume that when they go home, they go and watch the news with their parents, that is what they're going to be consuming, right? But there's such nuances and complications on the different experiences that young people have in South Africa that it would be very binary to just say that they all experience politics in a specific way, and so therefore this is the only thing that they read and this is the only thing that they watch. And I think that links to pretty much what most of the speakers have spoken about, that our people who are in power right now need to be aware of these different forms of expression that young people have, and not necessarily these different forms of expression, but also these different means of mobilizing their thoughts to begin with. The power of social media being a valid means for them to state their views and their opinions regarding something that has happened on a political level. The power of social media platforms on your Twitter platforms, where you can only have 140 characters, but within those 140 characters, you can state your opinions on where you're kind of standing with things, right? So I do think that how young people engage with sources when it comes to political participation is extremely nuanced in nature. And because it is nuanced, the system itself, the institutional system of democracy, has to respond to that nuance. Should it remain not responding to the nuances of the system, there are going to be more and more despondent young people who will continue to feel as though their opinions are not being heard. I also want to just stretch that a bit further and say that in circumstances in which civic society now has to play a role in educating young people about political processes, right? There also has to be a consciousness in that space. And I think through working with DDP, we have been very much aware of this. There has to be a consciousness in that space that how you and I understand political participation, and let's say we understand it at an academic level, and we can engage with it on a philosophical level with all these different academic terms, it is important for it to be broken down for someone that we go out into the communities and go tell them about the political processes, to understand in their language, and not only to just understand in their language, but to be able to comprehend it and take it out into their society further. But I think what Dimple had unpacked that very much so. The obstacle of jargons is something that really has to be looked into, but also it's very important to note that the types of jargons that politicians use in these quote unquote speeches are not necessarily unappealing. Perhaps they are unappealing to the constituents of young people that have no motivations to be fully involved in politics, but are appealing and are languages that are understood by, let's say, the cadres within the political parties themselves. So there's a sense of exclusivity that these political parties, political leaders do, where they will speak a language that its constituents will understand, making it very difficult for someone who has got apolitical views to engage with it, or to feel as though these same people are the exact same people who are going to go into government position and quote unquote represent the interests that are good for the whole good of the state and for the whole good of South Africa. So it's very complex and very nuanced question, that, and I think I can really speak about it for a really long time. But I do think that before we generalize and just say that all young people read and watch specific things, we have to break down to the context of the young person that we're talking about. What is their background? What is their age? What means of communication do they even have regarding political processes? And move on from there. So yeah, I think that's how I'm going to answer that particular question. Brian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Young. I think the lecturer in you is coming out. And so I think it's also very important that every time we talk about a broad category such as youth, that we are willing to engage with the difficulty that comes in disaggregating all of these young people that we're talking about. It's important that we don't paint people with one brush. I think some of the resistance that came when we were talking about South Africa as a rainbow nation is that it seemed in some effect that the lines were becoming too blurry between the different colors, at least insofar as what we intend to do. And so we still stand firmly that whilst youth is a broad category, it's also important that we understand and are engaging with the specific nuances of young people at different stages of development. And so even when we talk about this subject matter, we must be willing to also engage with it from that level. Crystal, your thoughts, and then perhaps asking, there was a question as to whether civil society is doing anything to ensure that young people go register. And perhaps when Lorato and Tempo come back, maybe you can also talk to us about this thing. If that, yes, young people are not turning up to the polls, but young people are participating elsewhere. What's going to shift? What's going to move us to the place where we recognize those spaces as legitimate insofar as places where we can start to get insights from young people, but also spaces that themselves that have the ability to influence policy and the ways in which we engage with the dominant sort of party political structures. Crystal, your thoughts on some of what's been said, but also some responses to the questions.
Thanks, Mwandla. I think what's important to highlight here is that none of us, political parties, those of us civil society, we must not become complacent, because youth and the changing landscape of young people means that even if something is effective now in communicating with young people at the pace that technology moves in, 3 months from now, it's not going to be as effective. So even our lessons, the WhatsApp group worked really well in, 2020, and it's still active now. But where we found we really get really meaty insights these days are Twitter spaces. That's where conversations where young people really get into, the meat of things and feel comfortable in expressing themselves. And, 6 months from now, the way to have these conversations might shift again. And so I think we need to have an agility and a flexibility and a humbleness in the work that we do to recognize when maybe something that we thought was the way to do it and the way to engage with young people isn't effective anymore, and then to change and to be able to do that. Humbly accepting that we don't have all the answers. And even if we are still young ourselves, or if we aren't and we've aged out of being young people, that we can still understand the needs of young people and listen to them, really listen to them. So I think I just wanted to add that. And thanks, Younger, for raising the point of, we speak about youth generally. And I think we all make this mistake. When I speak about youth, I mean 15 to 35. And as you say, that's a broad spectrum of young people. What's relevant for a 15-year-old and what is top of mind for them and their issues is completely different to that of a 30-year-old. And so I think, there are various organizations working with particular groups of young people. I think of Equal Education, and I think of the younger group of young people within that broad youth constituency, and how well they've done in engaging, youth in schools with things that are really, very relevant for young people in that immediate environment. Less relevant for a 25-year-old or a 30-year-old, but very relevant for youth that are in schools. And so I think we all need to understand the value that we bring as civil society into these different subsectors of young people. And how do we then bring those insights together in a collective good that really drives the political space for the benefit of all young South Africans and not, a select few. And I see that there's a question from Ras, how is civil society helping society to ensure more young people go and register? I assume you mean registered votes. I'm going to answer the question like that. I hope that's what you mean. I think it's it was raised earlier, I forget which of the panelists raised it, but it's difficult to encourage young people to go and vote for people when they don't see themselves represented there. But at the same time, that's the system we have currently. So we almost need to tackle it at both ends. We need to have programs and conversations like have been mentioned here. Rivonia Circle is a great example of, and the campaign of Young and Presidential of having these young leaders that are then equipped to to take up space. But while that kind of pipeline is happening, how do we encourage young people to kind of vote with what is available, even if that isn't the ideal at this moment? It is what we have, and to have young people realize their power in, as I said, not only voting but the accountability that goes after that vote is cast, after that initial comment is made, for young people to realize they do have power and they do have sway. And I think that is our work as civil society. That is the civic education. This is political education around helping young people to realize their power in various ways, and giving young people the platform to channel that power and learning. I myself was really humbled when we had a conversation around the general education certificate, the grade 9 exit certificate, as it's called colloquially, in that WhatsApp group that Dimpo and I have mentioned. There were insights that came from that group that myself and my other colleagues who, have been working in the space for a while and thought we had lots of the answers. There was stuff we hadn't thought about at all. And that happens to me many times where young people will say something and I'm like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And I think we need to realize the value that young people have and young people more broadly than the few that are really, working within youth development programs. A broader constituency of young people need to understand the value that they bring, and then how do we harness and provide platforms for that power and that energy. So I think that's my closing comments, Pamandla.
Okay, thank you very much, Crystal. Was that your closing statement, comment as in goodbye? But of course, I think I'll offer each of the speakers 1 minute each, just some final thoughts based on the subject matter that we've covered today. I think one thing that becomes important for me is what's going to make the needle sort of tick over. There's a sense that the South Africans are very frustrated with the current political moment that we're confronted with, and unfortunately, that frustration hasn't found itself in the polls yet. What, from your perspective individually, and in terms of the institutional knowledge that you might have, that's going to make the needle tick over? Hopefully, it doesn't surface as a July unrest moment as we saw last year, but that we are in a space where something more constructive is going to help us to move to the right direction. At least, are you hopeful, at least, about the ways in which our politics is responding or engaging young people? Maybe that's the way we frame the last sort of space comment, rather. Let me start with you, Lorato, and then we'll go with Yanga, then Dimpo, and then we'll end off with Crystal.
Thank you, Spamandla, and once again, thank you to all the panelists. Honestly, if we were to use the current system, I'm not hopeful, right? But I am encouraged by the insights that we've been getting from the number of programs, particularly the Democracy Builder, that we've been running. So one of the, and I spoke earlier about, we need a reimagination of some sort, and how we've captured this reimagination at the Rivonia Cycle. We call it South Africa 2.0, where we literally, solicit ideas and views from people in terms of what kind of South Africa do they believe they deserve, and the kind of leadership they believe they deserve. And a lot of these insights, as Crystal was sharing earlier, they are interesting, most importantly, listening, right? But almost lastly is around, the biggest thing around showcasing, and Dimpo was talking to this earlier, around maybe one of the things that should be one of our biggest takeouts, or at least my biggest takeout of this conversation, is that we need to collaborate efforts in showcasing and amplifying, these amazing young people out there. I look at the UK, they're now replacing their prime minister. And if you look at the 5 candidates that are there, you have Kishi Sunak, who's 42, Liz Truss, who's 46, Kenny Modrak, who's 49, Kemi Benedok, who's 42, and Tom Tulgat, who's 49. all of them are under 50. So you are guaranteed that the next Prime Minister of the UK will be under 50, right? And I imagine it is this kind of reimagination that we need to see in the political culture and the shift in the South African politics. And it's not going to do it. It's not going to magically create itself. All of us here in the room and many other people, as you know, we think a lot about how to capture and make sure that we project this kind of image, or at least the reimagined South Africa. I'm truly believing that we are going to find a lot more young people who see themselves, and will not have the kind of voter apathy that we are seeing, because the more young people see themselves in the people, the public representatives or the potential public representatives, the likelihood is that they will turn up to vote, and they will then want to participate actively in politics. And that is my biggest wish. Thank you once again, Spaman.
Very much, Lorato, for your insights. Thank you very much for spearheading the campaign for Young and Presidential. I think it's an important moment in our country, and of course, there have been similar moments in other countries. For instance, with the Not Too Young to Run in Nigeria, where they were able to legislate a lower minimum age for people to be able to contest political office, for instance. And I think at least we need to start getting the conversation going quickly in this country, and I think it's time. You can reach Rivonia Circle on the various social media at Rivonia_circle. And yes, of course, Lorato's threads have been reached by Rivonia Circle, but you can also find him at Lorato Jekeng on Twitter as well. Can we then hear from Yanga in terms of your final inputs and perhaps how hopeful are you that things are moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I think I share the same sentiments as Lorato, and the fact that if we keep things the way that they are right now, we're not going to see much progress. And I think there's just three primary things that I believe are of importance moving forward regarding this conversation. And the first is to continue to have an improvement in civic education for young people to understand the political system. And actually not even just for young people, but just to make it accessible and available for everybody, where civic education is not class-based, is not only for a specific group, but it is for everybody. So everyone is kind of like on the same page in understanding the political system, what it is, how does it work for them, and in what ways they can participate in them. And then I think the second thing I'm calling for is to have actual concrete steps to fully integrate young people into the political system. And by this, I mean, having even perhaps quotas for young people, some sort of proportional representation in executive bodies, having consultative bodies of young people that participate directly in policy-making decisions, and even within policy-making decisions, ensuring that policy-making is accessible, and there isn't a sense of elitism and policies being so distant that people cannot understand them. They need to be accessible. They need to be answering and catering to what young people actually want. I'm advocating, for facilitating new forms of voting. I think digital voting is perhaps a completely different topic, and maybe Mail and Guardian can give us that avenue to discuss that. But to facilitate new forms of voting, and it means to encourage young people to go ahead and vote and to make it more accessible to them, to adapt the current political system to the internet era and to the new forms of mobilization. Those steps are like so crucial to fully integrate young people into the political system. And I think the third step for me is perhaps one that's a bit more dear to me, is the importance of intergenerational dialogues, right? There's a writer, Martin Gurry, and he'd written a book called The Public Revolt. And in the book, he speaks about the dangers of how society is right now, where you kind of have people only associating with people that kind of look like them, or people that share the same opinions and views. And there's very little means for people to interact with people that they don't necessarily agree with. And that is what is needed for a democracy to be healthy, is disagreements, and also, but moving from that system to compromise. And I think that our society right now is at a risk of a growing social cleavage between the older generation and the younger generation. And it is very important to make sure that we're not treating the two as homogenous groups. And they are actually, there's platforms in which both can be addressed, and both can be involved in these very crucial processes that I just mentioned. But yeah, otherwise, thank you so much for this incredible conversation.
Thank you very much, Yanga. Of course, Yanga is one of our colleagues here at the Democracy Development Program, and you're able to find us on our social media at DDP Democracy, and on our Facebook page, it's the Democracy Development Program NPC. If I remember correctly, otherwise Shawama comms. So thank you very much. And now, Yanga, your final thoughts? Dimpo, your final thoughts. You're muted, Dimpo, sorry. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think I'd like to just touch briefly on the issue of what civil society organizations are doing to encourage young people to register. So last year during municipal elections, we had a series, and it was called Election Education. I think more than just getting young people to register, it's very important for us to make sure that young people understand the system first. Young people understand why they're voting. They understand what it means to vote in a municipal election, that they understand the difference between a municipal election and, a national election, for example. Are we creating platforms for young people to have direct conversations with the people who are asking for their votes? Are young people given space to be election observers? So how can young people really influence, I think, the voting process, but also influence the ways in which things happen in their communities, even beyond the election? Because I think, as has been mentioned, it does not help young people to kind of push them to register to vote if they don't feel like there are enough quality political options available for them, or that they're not represented on by the people that they see on the ballot. So I think for us it's more important to just get young people to be a part of the electoral process and civic processes holistically. On whether or not I am hopeful about young people taking up space in leadership positions, a big part of my job at Youth Lab as community manager is just sharing stories and dialoguing with young people. And so I speak to young people who are activists, who are entrepreneurs, young people who are in political office. And I am always so blown away by the passion, the enthusiasm, the commitment to lead, the commitment to change things, even from, inside the current political system, which is very, bureaucratic and incredibly rigid. But young people are doing the work. Young people are doing the work to bring other young people along with them. Young people are doing the work to make their communities better. Young people are doing the work to educate people within their communities. So it's very difficult, I think, to be in this line of work and not be hopeful. But I agree that we need to see a significant shift in our political system if we're going to create space for a more diverse group of people to take up leadership. I am encouraged with what's happening with the electoral amendment bill, which might bring some very significant changes in terms of how we vote and how we hold people that have been voted into political office accountable. we did some work, in fact, in that WhatsApp policy group together with My Vote Counts, where we had their senior researcher come in and explain to young people what the Electoral Amendment Bill means and how it's going to change the way that people vote and how political parties are held accountable with regards to things like party financing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think more civic education, but also, yes, hopeful, I think, because of those changes, I think that we might see, but also just hopeful because, young people are brilliant, and I'm lucky that I get to see that firsthand.
And that you yourself are a brilliant young person. So don't forget yourself in these conversations. I think it's important that the work that we do in our individual organizations is also seen from the light of, I'm one of those young people that sometimes are talked about. But it's important that you recognize that if you see me as being capable enough to be able to lead in some of the spaces internally in my own organizations, also consider what other young people who might not have had the same opportunities that I have had, who are also in positions potentially that need to be most spotlighted, as Lorato was talking about. Crystal, your final comments, and then we'll run up today's discussion. Of course, Dimpo is a youth manager at Youth Lab, and they can be found at Youth Lab ZA on Twitter and other social media spaces. Crystal?
Thanks, Mamandla. And I think some really great points have been raised. And I think I want to echo what Dumpo's just said. What do I feel hopeful about? Young people make me feel hopeful. The things I'm less hopeful about, as has been said, is the system within we find ourselves. But I do believe that, if we continue to create these various avenues and platforms for these amazing young people to shine and to, let us benefit from their brilliance, like, as you said, people on this call often forget to mention themselves, like Dimpo. I'm encouraged that there is an impetus and there is an appetite from, government to include more young people. We see that with various, conversations around youth councils. And as Dimpo says, the Gauteng is the first kind of youth forum that's been set up, but I am hopeful that will, snowball into the other provinces. So these kinds of things do give me hope. As Yanka said, I think there's a lot of room for a conversation around different forms of engaging just at the voting level with online platforms, etc., given the world we live in and where young people are, which is on their phones a lot of the time. But as she said, that's a separate conversation. And I think this idea that has also been raised already, which is something we're very passionate about at Youth Capital, I think is evidenced by how well we've worked with many people on this call and how strongly we believe that collaboration is key, that no one young person, no one organization, not even government themselves alone can tackle these really broad, sweeping, deep and complex issues that are riddled with systemic barriers. We all need to play our part and to honestly have conversations around the things we've learned that have worked and the things we've learned that haven't worked well, and to be vocal about that and to put that out into the public domain so that others can learn from our mistakes, but also replicate where we've done things really well. And so I think that's it from me. And thanks for this opportunity for the great discussion today.
Thank you very much, Crystal, and thank you to Youth Capital for the extending a hand of partnership to as many of us as possible in the different spaces that we occupy. The thing you say about our ability to reach across sort of the country could not be possible without the sorts of partnerships that we have, but also in terms of capacity. We might be strong in one element, but we definitely for sure know Youth Capital / Youth Lab and Rivonia Circle and the likes might have an upper hand in other areas. And so to recognize that and to be willing to work with that as well. Youth Capital can be found on various social media at Youth Capital SA. And so they are very incisive insofar as the research that they provide, and it will be important for us to continue to engage that level. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, and thank you to you, the delegates who have been participating actively in our comment section, for providing us with an audience, but also providing us for a basis for discussion. The ways in which we create webinars, but also the processes that we do at various community level is in response to a need that we get made aware of by our communities. And it's important that should you become aware of anything that ties into the work that we do, that you feel free to reach out to us at info@ddp.org.za. You can also reach out to us on our social media at DDP Democracy. And so we look forward to engaging you further. We do have another webinar upcoming, and we're hoping that will be taking place in August, and we do look forward to having you on board in relation to that. So thank you very much for your participation, and we do look forward to seeing you in future.
Plato said, "Who will guard the guardians?" Who are our guardians? Do they care about us? Are they accountable for their actions, or are they above the law? Who elects these guardians? Us? Them? Someone else? And if they guard us, who will guard them? Who will guard the guardians? The Malin Guardian, if you really want to know.